gonna let you go first when he says we're live.
Yeah, ok.
There you go.
Olá, bom dia a todos e a todas. Estamos aqui para mais um Diálogos Tributários da UERJ. Dessa vez, nós temos o nosso primeiro encontro com uma convidada internacional, a minha querida amiga Alison Christian. So, we are going to shift to English. We are not going to do this in Portuguese this time, maybe next time.
Although I understood some of what you were saying there, Sergio. So yeah.
Mostly your name when I said Alison Christian, you understood perfectly.
No, I got the Derechio Internazionale. I got that part too.
So good morning, everyone who is watching us live now. I'm very happy today. This is the last event of this that we are going to do this year, and I think it's great to have Alison Christian with us today. Alison is a professor of tax law at McGill University in Canada. We met back in 2016, I guess.
Yeah.
We were both general reporters for the IFA Congress in Rio. Alison was doing subject 1, I was doing subject 2. And after our meetings in Basel in Switzerland, we had the idea to edit a book together, which we did. It was a book on tax sovereignty in the BEPS era. We were so happy with the result of the first book that we decided to do a second one, which is about to be released on multilateralism and international taxation. Actually, for us to say correctly, the name of the book is a Multilateral Convention for Tax, which was edited by Pluer, and it's going to be published this December. So I don't know, maybe it's going to be available in next week. And of course, the whole production of the book was hugely impacted by the pandemic.
Yeah.
At some point, I thought that we're not going to make it this time. We lost authors, we got new authors, but the book is out, is ready, and we had the idea to have this chat. Probably next year we are going to do something more structured to discuss the book, invite the other authors to be with us. So it's gonna be, we'll probably do something more formal in the manner of a book launch. But we thought it would be good to get together today and talk a little bit about multilateralism and international taxation. What's the future? What we see happening in the realm of international taxation in the near future. So again, Alison, I'm pretty excited to have you here at the Rio de Janeiro State University, probably your first time here, even though virtually or digitally, or I don't know. Yesterday, I for the first time was reading and listening to podcasts on the Metaverse.
Oh.
And I was but I don't know, maybe next time we do it, it's going to be in the Metaverse, and where my university will be just, some virtual space where we are going to meet.
An apparition.
In the meantime, we are here. Maybe before the Metaverse, you will be at the university at some point. I really appreciate you being with us today. And so I would just, listen to you and have you say your first words and greetings to whoever is watching us live and whoever will watch us later on. And then we can move on and start discussing more technical stuff.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think we'll be like MetaTax Prof 1 and MetaTax Prof 2 when the Metaverse starts. And when you can all be sure, those of you watching can all be sure that Sergio and I will be there. We will be in the metaverse as our meta selves talking about tax. Everybody else is going to be like trying to do Bitcoin things, and we'll be still talking about tax. So it's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. You're right, I haven't been to your university in person, and I'm only there virtually, which is to say I'm in the box you put on the screen, which is lovely. As always, lovely to see you. And I think we have good timing, Sergio. So it's true that the book was, as book projects often are, it always takes more work than you think. And there's always, authors are always sort of, struggling with their own, timelines and so on. But we have good timing because the OECD, of course, in the throes of pillars 1 and 2 is talking about the next the next steps down the road. And the next step down the road of pillar 2 is another multilateral convention. So we're right in the right place to talk about this. I appreciate your school putting this event together and giving us this opportunity to chat a little bit about multilateralism writ large, and then more specifically talk about our books. Shall we introduce our book?
Yeah. Certainly the publisher will like it, especially if it results in any sales or anything like that.
Of course.
Maybe we should start by saying that I think that we are pretty much on the same side in terms of being critical thinkers of what could be presented as standard international taxation thinking. So we are kind of rebels, I would dare saying. I don't know, but I think we have some kind of unorthodox approach to international taxation. The other day we were talking about maybe doing something like a international taxation textbook from a developing country perspective, and you were saying, oh yeah, but should I be in that project? But you are one of the most progressive thinkers in international taxation nowadays, and so having that as an assumption that we are both kind of on the same side. We have both been very critical of the role of the OECD in the context of designing the so-called international tax regime or anything of the sort. How do you see, because if you look back, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, multilateralism wasn't really a topic. So international taxation was basically focused on bilateral conventions. So we were mostly discussing bilateral relations. Of course, we know that international taxation has always been driven by power. So it's political power, economic power. I often say this to students when I'm introducing the topic. So this is not a technical realm. So it's mostly about the power of nations to impose their will, to impose their agendas, and etc. But until, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, we would be mostly discussing bilateral relations, and thus the power was exerted in a way that it's more in the design of the models, so on the model conventions, and on how countries were able or were not able to negotiate better treaties for themselves. For instance, Brazil is a country that, even though is a developing country, an emerging economy, has always been able to negotiate pretty good tax treaties for its own sake. But now, especially after BEPS and mostly after 2015, we have all these talk about multilateralism and a multilateral approach on international taxation, regarding international taxation. So do you think that all this multilateralism talk increases the risk for poor countries and those countries who, cannot sit at the table, because everybody talks about level playing field, but, this is, grandmas telling stories to their grandchildren. There's no level playing field. So countries are different. They have different levels of power. They have different levels of influence. They have different levels of technical knowledge of very sophisticated tax issues. Yeah. So do you think that we are moving in the direction of something that could be even worse from this perspective of uneven relations than it was before? Because as I've been saying, the international tax system has always been broken. It has always favored developed countries. It has always favored the most rich countries in the world. And so could it get worse? Are we moving in the direction of something worse right now with all this multilateral discussions? What do you think?
Oh, you start with such a sad, depressing question.
We can get happier throughout our conversation.
So I think the road to the MLI is fascinating. I think that's why we start our book with that first part being about the purpose and the nature and the significance of the MLI, right? Thinking about how did we get to the MLI? And in your chapter, which is part of that first part of the book, I think I rightly ask, whether multilateralism is going to achieve tax rule coordination, and if that's really the only way or even the best way. And so I agree with you that those are the right questions to ask. I think that the fascinating part of the book for me in this area and asking this question about whether we're going to be better off starts with, well, how come we got to this? So the chapters that we have by Rita Pires, so, she talks about the institutional and historical context of the MLI, looking at political actors, how they establish a need for reform. I think that's where your unease starts, legitimately starts right there. When people say, okay, well, which geopolitical actors establish a need for reform? And Rita's chapter shows that it's the so-called key geopolitical actors, and then they deliver these reforms with different kinds of mechanisms, some more innovative than others. And so in that sense, you can see in the first couple of chapters, and Rita's among them, where, there's some skepticism that the MLI is really a revolution. It's more of a continuation or she calls it a soft evolution from one stage to the next. And I think that's what worries you, rightfully worries you, because, why should we be confident if we're continuing the past? Why should we have any confidence in that? Because we don't think that our past institutions and processes have delivered to us the thing that we agree with. Instead, I think you and I agree. Maybe this is why you say we're critical or we're radical or whatever words you want to use. But when people say level playing field or equal footing, my response to that was, you can't build an international tax regime on a metaphor. But in fact, that seems to be the attempt being made here, is instead of dealing with the hard reality of what that metaphor means, we just say these metaphors. And as you say, these are the stories we like to tell ourselves. But if you dig into how we get to our storytelling in international tax, you'll be distressed. And then just to add to that Rita's first chapter lays out that history, but then we have a couple chapters by Dr. Vanessa Arruda Ferreira and Natalie Bravo, and each of them looks at the public international law aspects of the MLI. And I think these are fascinating chapters, because the idea of the MLI still isn't really, to me, that clear. I don't know that everyone who works with this text really fully understands its implications from a public international law perspective. And so when you have those critiques, which I share, about who makes these decisions and what kind of mechanisms they choose and the implications of those, the the inquiry into the public international law nature of those instruments actually makes me wonder very much, where are we headed? And it actually could be worse, not only for the distributive implications, which are real and they're always urgent to me, but also for the precedent. Like, we've set a precedent now as to what is okay, like what mechanisms are acceptable and how we think they fit. So I think there's two reasons that your sad first question might have to be answered as yes, it could actually be worse. And we have to, I think, be alive to that and be vigilant to that and be wary of those, the things we think in tax and how they connect up to the world around us.
Because I think you just said, you said many things that are relevant, but I think there is a key aspect in what you just said and mentioning Rita's chapter, which is we have a problem which is institutional. Thus far, we haven't been able to design a kind of institution that would, participate in the design of an international tax system that would actually be fair and just for countries with different levels of economic development.
Right.
The UN at some point tried to be this institution, but I don't know if you watched the discussions of the UN committee for the approval of Article 12B. I watched the meeting, and it's amazing how developed countries, they work to block any change that might benefit, even if just a little, less developed economies. So, and in that sense, it's I think that my remarks are sad because they are kind of hopeless, because if we don't have the right institutions, we can't have the right outcome. The OECD, in my perspective, has been trying since the Global Forum on exchange of transparency and exchange of information, they have been trying to present themselves as something more inclusive. So the Global Forum is an attempt, the inclusive framework is an attempt, but in the end, I think it's more kind of a marketing campaign. It's like, we are listening to everybody, so whatever outcome is fair, because everybody had equal footing and could present their points of view. Everybody's view was considered. So whatever we recommend is a consensus. Everybody's in agreement. But in that respect, I'm really not very hopeful that we'll ever have an institution that will be, actually legitimate to defend the interests of all countries. And it's so it's, you said it's sad. Yeah, it is. And what amazes me the most, and maybe we can discuss this a little bit more, is how developing countries, they don't stand their ground.
Right.
So they are just willing to follow, especially those who want to become OECD members. I remember, I don't know if you had this in your reports back in 2017, but in my reports, in my reports in subject 2 of the Rio IFA Congress, we had a question which was, is your country willing to accept the BEPS recommendations in actions 8 through 10? That was one of my questions. And it was, I love your mug, by the way. I was going to mention this at the beginning, but I love your mug. And
thank you.
We were, so one of the questions was, will your country adopt And I was surprised with answers from countries like Argentina or Peru, or so South American countries who just, so their reports would just say, yes, we are going to accept and we are going to implement because we want to become OECD members. I said, shit, this is not a good answer. So it's a, you don't adopt something that, you know, changes entirely your domestic tax system because you want to become an OECD member. So one thing that amazes me, and in that sense, I have always been very proud of Brazil. And people, you know, sometimes mistake that by some sort of testament to the righteousness of everything that Brazil does, which is not the case. So we do a lot of bad things. So we have a lot of bad policies in place. But I've been always very proud of Brazil because Brazil is a developing country or an emerging economy. These concepts, they are always a lot of very blurry to me. But Brazil has always been able to implement the measures that it thinks is the best way forward for the country. So we have always been able to be very independent, which does not mean disconnected, because especially after BEPS, we are not disconnected. We participate in all working parties, so we are there in the discussions. So, but that does not mean that we are going to adhere to anything that, you know, people ask us to implement. But that's not usually the case. So maybe circling back to our initial discussion, is there any reason for us to be hopeful and enthusiastic? I didn't mention that at the beginning, especially for the Brazilian audience who, you know, maybe people who don't know your work. So I really admire your work. I think you're one of the, you know, top scholars in international taxation currently. I sometimes make fun with you that, you know, being friends with Addison is one of my titles. So it's it's very, I would very much like to hear your inputs on this.
Thank you, Sergio. Well, you know, the feeling is mutual. I think very highly of you, and I appreciate all the work that we do together. And I think that's why there should be reason for to be positive. All right. So you talked about Brazil's stance in the international tax arena, and I'm with you 100%. I agree with you. Brazil has been a leader and a model. And what is so striking to me is the lengths that people will go to say why Brazil has to change, even as the world is adopting Brazil's style. So like it's like a cognitive dissonance moment for me always. So we're over there in pillar 1, talking about fixed margins. And how long has Brazil said transfer pricing is fine, but we have to have fixed margins in order to make it functional? How long has Brazil said that? And how long has the world, well, specifically the OECD said, yes, but you have to stop doing that, Brazil, because you are going to accede to the OECD. And the OECD is firmly committed to the arm's length principle. And the arm's length principle requires you to do a comparative analysis of non-arm's length, of arm's length parties for your non-arm's length transactions. And so you have to stop doing fixed margin because that's a proxy, or that's not arm's length. It's just a set number. So, you know, it's almost perverse to me that even while all of that discussion is going on in pillar 1, Brazil is over in accession talks to the OECD where they're saying, okay, we're not going to do transfer pricing the way we've been doing it because the OECD says that's not arm's length. So there's clearly some, I don't know what it is. Okay. So there's some dissonance here. I don't like to call it names, even if I have it in my head as to why it might be that dissonance exists. But there is a dissonance here where Brazil has known what to do in this area. And it took a long time, but the OECD has, I think, learned from Brazil. They have learned, but they don't like to admit that they learned from Brazil. They want to say, well, this is the US that made this up, or like, this is, the OECD, we're so clever here over at the OECD. Look at us making up, clever formulas. So there's the reason for hope. Okay. It's both, it's hope and not hope at the same time, because there's a reason for hope in that, can we learn from Brazil? Yes. Can we learn from India? Actually, yes, we can. We can learn how to do tax better, to do international tax better. Will people from key geopolitical countries admit where they learned their lessons? No. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then that's how I'm so afraid of this multilateral initiatives, because all of a sudden the pressure, because if we look at Brazil's example again, we haven't always been able to handle ourselves well in bilateral discussions. But all of a sudden, if it's the whole globe, and in our first book, that I've been working on a concept for quite some time now, which is international tax imperialism. I'm not saying that I invented this, probably not, but this is something that, and I think the saddest part about international tax imperialism is that it conquers the minds of the lawyers and tax advisors and scholars of countries.
Yeah.
So here, for instance, in Brazil, I'm sometimes seen as a kind of unorthodox figure in terms of international taxation, mostly because sometimes I just say, what Brazil is trying to do is right. The tax authority's interpretation is okay. And because the mindset, I would say that the tax mindset, the prevailing tax mindset in Brazil is OECD driven.
Yeah.
Even though we have never been members, we don't know if we'll be. And so it's very strange, because
it is. But here's a reason I agree with you that is strange, but it's not that unusual, right? I mean, the OECD countries have dominated the world economy. The fact that Canada is a member of the OECD doesn't, it does not escape my notice. Like, that is something that Canadians notice and are in some way, they're proud of their role in that. My own view of that is not as optimistic about Canada's role in those proceedings. I think that we need to do better. Like, I think we need to recognize when we are advocating for a position which is not just, but is in our national self-interest, to argue for an outcome which is unjust. That I think is something that is very hard for people to do. It's hard for anyone to say, yeah, we're taking more than we should. But here, I think maybe the reason for optimism, or maybe where we should focus our energies, you and I, is making sure that the next generation of scholars is not always the last generation of scholars. It does not always have the same pedigree, does not always come from the same place, does not always have the same demographic outlook, and that we can learn from people from all over with their experiences, which are specific to their local tax environment. That as we just cannot live without diversity in all aspects of our understanding of our heuristic, right? Our world here, like, how do we know what we know? Who do we turn to get knowledge? That we just insist that we look across the world to get knowledge. And in that sense, the book that we have right now on the Multilateral Convention is, for me, a success in that way. And I think that we talked about this textbook where we focus on those views that aren't always the ones that are on that regular circuit of, the key, whatever. That for me, that's the future. And I think, I could be wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think some of the reason that Brazil might focus its heuristic, its international tax heuristic on the OECD is because there's just been such a volume of OECD influence in the world. And there isn't a volume of the counter of different perspectives. So we need to cultivate that as scholars, as mentors, as teachers, as people who observe the international arena. You and I are in position to just cultivate that. And that will change the next, maybe not too quickly, and we're not that effective at it, but we try, and that will redound like ripples in a pond somehow.
You were just talking about Canada right now, and you said that it's sometimes it's hard for countries to look beyond their national self-interest, and I think that that's one of the toughest parts of this discussion. How you because we have all these discussions about fairness, international equity, and etc. Mm-hmm. But if you look right now, yesterday I was again listening to a podcast, this time on vaccines and vaccination around the globe. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the numbers at Africa, and it's amazing how as a global society we will allow something like that happen. Because for instance, in Europe, we have something going on because there are lots of dumb people who doesn't believe in vaccines. So it's a different story. So it's anti-vax. But in Africa, there are countries that they just can't vaccinate their population. Right. It's kind of around 5-6% of Africa has been vaccinated so far. And the other countries, they just don't care much about that. And when you look at a situation like this regarding a global pandemic, and it's of course totally naive to believe that you can disregard what's happening there, because as we are seeing with this new virus, if you have the virus circulating in Africa, at some point it will reach Canada. So it's a certainty. At some point it will be in Canada, it will be in France, it will be in Germany. It's already in Belgium, it's already in some European countries. But when we bring this discussion to taxation, I always feel a little bit naive when I consider that countries will look beyond their national self-interest. So whenever I'm talking about international equity and everything so these topics, which we like because it's kind of our background to discuss fairness and everything, but I feel so naive when I'm discussing these topics, because for instance, we have our very good friend Tarcísio, and who wrote a beautiful doctoral thesis on theory of international taxation and everything, and it's a beautiful book. But when I'm reading that book, I can't help myself not to feel like, this is a very beautiful theory, but it will always be a very beautiful theory because it's without institutions. And so how can we, do you have any idea on how we can move from theory to reality, to practice? Because one way would be we could have some arrangement between less developed countries to try to impose their position, but it's unthinkable, because when you look at Brazil, India, China, Russia, so we just don't have any synergy between these countries. It's more, they have mutual needs and necessities, but there is no synergy. There is no, and all these countries are actually looking for their national self-interests.
But narrowly construed, right?
Deal with this?
Yeah, but that national interest is narrowly construed, I think, if you don't like your point. I think your point is that we don't live in a world of siloed nations where your actions only affect yourself and you can control your destiny by looking inward. We know that. And I think that the multilateralism idea, I mean, whether we agree with the technical rules or not, the idea of it is a recognition, a really basic recognition that your national self-interest depends on other countries not interfering with your goals and your agenda. And likewise, your goals and agenda not interfering with others so that you can come to mutual agreement. And I think you rightly worry about that because, again, with the geopolitical situation in which we find ourselves, the rights, the goals and agendas of some countries dominate, and those of others are either ignored or, even worse, they're trampled on. And here again, I think the book, the MLI, the Multilateral Convention for Tax, I think really takes aim at this. So, we skip over the middle part for a minute to get to the last part of the book, which talks about implementation. In the chapters in this last part, a lot of the discussion is about, well, what does it mean to say harmonization? I mean, what are we saying when we say that things are agreed and when we talk about consensus? And I think we have a couple of chapters, one by Ricardo Garcia Antona, one by Christian Bilardi, both of whom take aim at what is this uniformity, because you need flexibility. And that's the real key element here of the MLI. And so this idea of like, well, how can we possibly get to a place where you can talk about fairness? Well, first you have to set terms in which to have that conversation. And if all we're ever doing is looking to the instruments we have and examining their uniformity and trying to make them more uniform without ever having that question, well, what is the uniformity for? Like, what does it serve, or what agenda is it, promoting? Then we will always be unsatisfied with that answer, right? So the construction, so for me, as we go into Pillar 2 and we start talking about another multilateral convention, I think we go back to the one we have now, the multilateral instrument, and we look, and our book does this, we look at, okay, well, what was it supposed to do? And we see the structure of it, the rule set, the ideas, the words that get used, and then how does it actually play out in practice? Like, what does it mean when you put words on a paper, but then there's still flexibility and countries are interpreting it according to internal norms? Well, we still haven't worked out what those norms are to begin with.
And there's an underlying question, which I try to present in my chapter in the book, which is, whose problem are we trying to solve?
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Because I think that this is the starting question.
Yes.
I remembered when the BAPS project started in 2013, we had a huge number of seminars, and so everything was BAPS here in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And I was just, saying, why are we so concerned with this?
Right.
Considering our situation, what is on the table, the rules we already have in place, the potential impact of this for us is very, very, very little.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But the as you said, the key players managed to sell the world that everybody needs to deal with BAPS now, because this is what's important to us.
And it may be that it's important to the whole world, but who decided that?
Yeah,
right. It was decided before there was an inclusive framework, for example.
And what I try to argue in my chapter is, maybe it's important to the whole world, but probably in different levels. It's not the same. So we are not, I make the comparison with terrorism. So terrorism is a problem to the whole world, But Brazil does not have the same problem with terrorism that the United States does, that Israel does. So it's a global problem. It is. But it's not the same everywhere. So, and that's one of my concerns with this kind of multilateral approaches, because you start saying, this is my problem. It's not mine. It's a world problem. I have the solution, and everybody in the whole world needs to implement this solution that is good for me.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the problem is not homogeneously felt or experienced, but the solution must be, right? That's kind of a,
So, and what amazes me is that you often don't have these discussions.
Right.
So here, for instance, when Brazil decided not to sign the multilateral instrument back in 2017, it was the criticism here was huge. Why are we not signing? We don't want to be part with the whole world. Everybody's signing. Brazil again wants to be the outcast. But why? The question should be, why should we sign? So why would it be good for us, to any extent, to sign the document?
Right.
But people don't ask those questions.
No, I agree.
Don't ask, why do we need a pillar 1 in Brazil?
No. Right.
So we don't need a pillar 1. We don't need a pillar 2, for that matter. So
exactly.
We have a broad CFC regulation, so which has always been hugely criticized.
Again,
even though it might make sense. And not if you're the only one in the world applying it, but as a global policy, maybe it would make more sense than what we have today.
Exactly. But that's the stage, right? Like this is what I think is unfortunately missing from the conversation, and that is the conversation about who decides what the issues are to be solved before they get solved, and that discussion has always been insular to as is laid out in our book, but to a couple of key players, namely the US, always, even though everyone knows the US does not sign on to multilateral things. Like they're simply not a signatory to the Common Reporting Standard. They're simply not a signatory to the MLI. They just don't do that, but they fully shape the agenda ostensibly to suit their own national interests, but I think in the long run to the negative detriment of everything and everyone. But that's so that structural problem that we don't have a committee that decides what the issues are to be solved. We do not have a committee, and we don't know how to make that committee, which is why you see a lot of calls for the UN should be doing this instead of the OECD, or there should be a world tax, that's why those conversations come up, because we want to have some idea of some kind of committee making that people can live with, right? And you'll hear like Ivan Ozai talks about and Irma Mascara talk about input and output legitimacy and so on, like building the right institution before you talk about whether the rule set that's been built is the right rule set. But like for good thinking, right thinking people, we all sort of, I think in our hearts are uncomfortable with a world in which the agenda is set by one or maybe two countries, and it must be shaped around those countries' priors, lest it be deemed a failure for the war.
I don't know if it's ignorance on my part, but maybe even on the academia, we are very scattered around the world. I don't know, maybe we should, think about some sort of academic group, getting together people who think alike, who see there's something maybe worth fixing. And I don't know, but we have a few comments here, but I would like to ask you maybe two questions, more concrete questions. We had the developments in the UN with Article 12A, Article 12B, pointing in the direction of a withholding solution. Do you think that this would be better than the discussions in Pillar 1? Because when I look at Pillar 1, I see a lot of complexity. One thing that I've been arguing for quite some time is when you come up with a solution in international arena, you need to take into account the institutional capacities of countries. So you can't come up with a very complex and sophisticated solution that countries will have problems to implement. And withholding is, pretty simple. It doesn't deal with all the situations, especially with the digitalization of the economy, but it would be a good start. I have always been very critical of Article 7, which I think should be eliminated from tax treaties. So the business profits provision is a shitty provision that, countries should refuse to include in tax treaties. And as a consequence, we could get rid of the permanent establishment as well. I know that this is maybe too, revolutionary, but if you look at what the UN has been doing with Article 12A and 12B, it's actually reducing the scope of Article 7. So they're not going as far as saying, so let's exclude Article 7, but they're taking things out of Article 7 and granting withholding rights to the source country. And I've always thought that it's simpler, easier. It's what Brazil has been doing for, since we implemented, we first started signing treaties. Isn't it easier than the discussions in Pillar 1? Shouldn't we move in the direction of a withholding, larger withholding taxing rights to source countries instead of discussing this complex and Pillar 1 solution? What do you think of that? So you're muted now. Did you do something?
Oh, sorry. There we go.
Okay.
100%. Yeah, definitely. We should not be. Okay. I don't know why countries that don't have that don't already have digital services taxes would adopt them now. So the US has said that if you adopt a digital service tax, we don't like it. So they're going to fight with you. Whether the US is right in that, I don't think they are. They consider it a trade violation. I think that's not true, but that's a big mess, right? But like the withholding provisions, there's a conceptual idea here that's difficult. I know it's difficult for non-tax people certainly to understand this, but it's even difficult for tax people sometimes to understand this. But when you think about business profits versus gross basis income streams that we tax on a withholding basis. So business profits is a characterization. It's not a thing that exists in nature. It's like a way we describe a certain way of receiving an income stream. And the other forms of income, like interest, dividends, are a different type of income stream, which we've decided at some point we can impose a tax on at a gross basis in lieu of an income tax. And there's a lot of history in that decision that we could debate, and we should debate, right? But to say that withholding on ad, for example, withholding on ad services instead of a digital service tax, to say that withholding on ad services is a no-no, that you cannot do that, it lies on top of a whole structure that no one is examining, I think, in the right way. Because if you examine the history of how we got to gross basis withholding taxes on dividends, interest, rents, and royalties, you would very quickly come to the conclusion that the advertising fees there's no really good valid reason why they can't be in that list. It's just they haven't been, and we have lots of reasons for that. And there's all kinds of technical stuff, but like the point is not, could you do this or could you do that? Or should you do this or should you do that? But the question is, who should decide what is acceptable and what is the norm? Who should decide what the international tax norm is such that this or that is a violation? And having not had that conversation ever, then when the UN comes up with Article 12A and then Article 12B, of course, people start saying, oh, well, wringing our hands and, rending of garments and so on, because, well, we can't do that because those are business profits and you already transacted those away in your treaties. Well, if you don't have a treaty with the US, you didn't transact those away. Even if you do have a treaty, you might not have transacted all those away because it could be in the other income. It's hard to say. Debatable. And even if you think you might have contracted them away, what treaty at this point is not changeable? Yeah. What treaty is not? So the whole story is complexified by the fact that where we are today is not some sort of natural, naturally occurring phenomenon. It's created, we constructed it. And the concept of income is not static, it's dynamic, and we're still constructing it. So we can change it.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here, and we are almost reaching 1 hour. I don't want to steal you away for much longer than that. We have a question from Francisco Moreira, my very good friend Francisco, and he's saying that there is a discussion that might be placed aside in this whole multilateralism discussions, the shift from income tax to consumption tax. That's an interesting topic. Whether a digital service tax, for instance, is actually a sort of VAT, for me, this is an income tax. It's an income tax. It's a withholding tax that people decided to call a different name to bypass the treaties.
Yes.
But it's for me, this is just treaty dodging. Yes. 101. So it's treaty dodging because it is no different from the withholding tax, and that has always been income tax. So the fact that it's levied on gross income or on revenues, it doesn't make much difference. It's the same. It's the same basis of the withholding tax that we have today. But we have all this discussion. So what is a digital service tax? Is a VAT type tax? It's an income tax. For me, it's an income tax. I don't know if you have ever discussed this, but it's what's funny here. It's interesting because we have been having all these discussions to save the income tax. Because what I've been saying is BAPs and everything. These are missions to save the income tax. The income tax is in crisis. We can't identify income anymore. When people are in the metaverse earning metaverse coins, how are we going to tax that? So it's the fact that there's a clear fact, which is our systems, they are in check, and we don't know, our entire way of life is in check, so we don't know what's going to happen in the 10 years, 20 years from now. But I think that there's this very interesting discussion of what is a digital service tax. I don't think that it is a consumption tax as Francisco describes here. For me, this is income taxation, gross income taxation, which has always been in place ever since we had withholding. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that characterization. I think it's an in lieu of. Yeah. I think it's a withholding tax in lieu of a net basis income tax.
Yeah, and we have Angelo Tsoukalas. And first, Angelo loved your mug as well. Apparently, you have a sideline of business here. You can instead of doing a book, next time we can think about how to have this line of mugs here in Brazil. Apparently, I don't know if it's gonna sell that well, but we have at least 3 or 4. And Angelo also asked you to talk a little bit about your Pillar 3 solution. And it's I always tell the story. I listen to podcasts, and I was listening to the Tax Notes podcast, and with an interview with you talking about Pillar 3. And a couple of days later, a client of mine asked me, so what is this Pillar 3 that OECD is coming with? So what is happening with Pillar 3? And I say, shit, Allison is writing papers and giving interviews, and now I have clients asking me about something that it's to this moment non-existent.
Yeah, it does not exist.
Yeah, it's an idea. So this is an idea that you developed working with Tarcísio when he was there with you, working at McGill. And so it would be interesting to listen to you and let people know what's pillar 3 in your in your theory.
Yeah, well,
what are you proposing?
So first of all, yes, you can go on Redbubble and you'll find my my I Love Tax Law in English, French, but maybe I should make a Portuguese version and then we'll see what's up. But that's just more for my own amusement. So I don't advertise it too much. But thank you. So, and the pillar 3 thing is really just saying that if you look at the elements of pillars 1 and 2, there's actually enough, we're starting to build enough precedent there that we could be talking about an excess profits tax based using those same principles. Of course, it went nowhere in terms of the OECD. No shocker there. I'm sure to you, Sergio, or anyone that's watching, that Tarcísio and my work would not immediately be picked up by the OECD and built into a new working committee. I laugh, but I mean, look, the point is that the pandemic did not slow down the work on pillars 1 and 2. And actually, some of the concepts of pillar 1 especially were extraordinary. They're extraordinary. They talk about being able to draw a line between normal profits and non-routine or supernormal profits. Now, some of us who remember our history will go back 100 years ago and see that same language in some of our treaties. Some of the early model treaties, there was a discussion about splitting profits into these different categories, and it was abandoned. And, the economics was not then what it is now, the economic ability to, kind of figure out what each dollar of profit emanates from. But, as you said, as you and I have talked about many times, and as we talk about in this book and in the other books, the other book we've written and the next one we'll write, the concepts that are evolving, they're built on historical understandings. And when you change them, it sort of changes everything. And then when the pandemic happened and people started talking about excess profits, but you haven't changed the nature of the world, which is that the wealthy are still escaping high taxes by moving things around. So if you want an excess profits tax, you still have the same problems that you had before. I hate to break it, but we haven't solved BEPS. We haven't actually solved it. So, and in the pandemic, kind of amping up the stakes where you have a lot of people going bust in the pandemic, but you also have some that are obviously benefiting from that situation. The OECD's Pillar 1, giving us the language of profits and supernormal profits, and talking about fixed margins is giving us a place to start maybe applying some pressure to that excess profits. And so we called it Pillar 3 because it was so built on the principles of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. But who knew that it would have that effect on your clients? I'll give you the link to that talk and that paper that you can put in the YouTube description if anybody wants to follow up on that later.
And it was a genius idea in terms of naming the
who knew? And then I'm going to call everything a pillar now from now on. Pillar 4, 5, 6.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe I guess this is it. So did we cover everything you wanted to discuss? I guess so.
We did, but one thing I want to just add, even though I know we're over time a little bit, I just want to add that
we don't really have a time limit.
Okay. Great. We'll just be here for another 6 or 7 hours. I just want to add that one of the most fascinating parts of the book that we were talking about today, the Multilateral Convention, one of the most fascinating parts of that book for me is the data analysis of the implementation to date, which you'll see this in a lot of different versions. So we have qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis in the book. So the qualitative, you have like Guillermo Tejera's examination of MLI interpretation, like GARS and SARS, and the different chapters that Marcus Gomez looking in GARS and the MLI, and we see these qualitative analysis, but also there's a couple chapters that I really think will give us some interesting things to think about going forward for the next multilateral convention. And in particular, I really like the chapters by Andrea Sacchi and Natalia Pushkareva, because they both survey the implementation, right? So Andrea Laura Riccardi Sacchi surveys the MLI in 32 Latin American and Caribbean countries. And she's just looking at how much did these countries actually take on norms when they really, most of them were not involved in the formulation of the BEPS initiative at all. And some of them aren't even inclusive framework members. And she just analyzes the coverage of the MLI, sort of looking at the transmission of these norms into countries that weren't part of the BEPS. I think this is really insightful analysis, because that is kind of where you're going. Well, like, how much influence will this have, and could it be getting worse? Further to that question, you start to look at these cross-country surveys. And then in Natalia Pushkareva's chapter, she looks at the 95 covered tax agreements that had been registered as of March 2021, when we closed the chapters in the book. And she's looking at an article by article comparison of all the agreed terms and looking at how countries are implementing them. This is a fascinating survey. Sometimes you're drilling down into the details of implementation, and sometimes you need to pull back and look at the bigger picture. And for me, all of the questions that we've been asking about who's in the committee and who forms the agenda and who ought to have a say and whose norms ought to be considered and what should we consider norms, all of that has to be examined both through deep qualitative case studies, which we have several of in the book, but also these sort of big picture zoom out views. And so I think that this is where the future is. So we have to do both of those things. And when we do them both, that's when we start to see the transmission of norms and their effectiveness. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think that's where you start to see where the pressure points could be. We might be able to see where a different view or a different perspective could get inserted into the conversation by kind of seeing where the take up is strong and where it's weaker, which I think we capture there. Just a little plug there for, that kind of analysis. This kind of research is, to me, I think, the key to doing better in the next round. I don't know if we'll do better. You're right, we could do worse, but we have some tools to analyze that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that even I don't know what's going to happen with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and we are in 2021, and we are. I've been thinking for some time whether we will reach 1928, which for me is an interesting year because it was the year of the first models of the League of Nations.
Yeah.
With the same international tax structure in place.
Right.
Because to some extent, all these movements, they give an impression that there's some change going on. But when we go back to the models and everything, the changes in the UN model with Articles 12A and 12B are more relevant than what's happening in the OECD model.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking what's going to happen in the next years and whether we will have a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the League of Nations models in 2028.
Well, maybe we could anticipate that and start thinking about that, because there were several different models. If you recall, there's the Mexico model and the London model, and there's a lot of controversy that hasn't been discussed as between which of those models got taken up. I think we can all guess which one. And maybe it is worth seeing how far how far we come. Okay, another book project, Sergio.
Yeah. We have more book projects than time.
Yeah,
we have just a final question here from Francisco. He mentions that if the US provided a foreign tax credit on DST paid elsewhere, the issue would be resolved, right?
Yeah,
I guess right, but since we have this, it becomes with a cheat when you say that the DST is not an income tax. So I guess there's no reason for the US to give a tax credit on something that you're saying that is not an income tax because you want to dodge the treaty.
Right.
So I don't know. I think that it's we're not going to move in that direction. I think that at some point we should just, deal with Article 7, grant source countries, withholding rights, more broad withholding rights. Maybe it's a matter of which rate would be applied. So here we often have 15%. 15% maybe is too high considering the level of income taxation in the world nowadays. Maybe it should be a lower rate, like the DST's rates are considerably lower.
Right.
So it's maybe it's a matter of just balancing the rates. And there is something we talked about Tarcísio's book before, and there is something in his book when he argues that maybe double taxation is not a big deal nowadays, because since the rates are so much lower than they used to be, maybe if you have 3% in one country and 12 in another, yeah, okay, you're still being taxed at a very reasonable level. Mm-hmm. It's not that double taxation would lead to a extravagant taxation. But okay, I think that we covered enough space.
I think so too.
Yeah. So maybe we can think about next year doing something with the authors by block. I don't know. We can think about that. Following the book's structure and discussing the chapters, having Andrea Riccardi and Natalia presenting their research and having the discussions with the more theoretical authors as well. It's gonna be very fun, I guess. So Alison, again, thank you very much for making the time. I know you are earlier in Canada, so it's what, 12 right now?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So thank you for being here with us today at the University of Rio de Janeiro. It's a pleasure having you here virtually. And thank you for everybody who endured our conversation live or later on.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. And I enjoyed the conversation very much. And as we can see, it's always the case. Whenever you start talking about international tax, there's always more to discuss. So maybe we'll do it again sometime. Yeah.
So since this is the last one you're going to do this year, I'm going to also take the opportunity to thank in Portuguese Professor Evanilda, a Agnes, que ajuda a gente com a imagem, o Vitor, que está sempre com a gente aqui nessas transmissões, dando apoio técnico, e a todo mundo da UERJ, meu agradecimento aqui, né, por a gente ter conseguido fazer essa sequência de eventos, foi fantástico. So, Alison, after, I know that you got 50% of that again.
A little less, maybe.
A little less this time. Okay. Now we're going to work on your Portuguese for the next.
Okay, we'll work on it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you. Obrigado a todo mundo. That's it.
Obrigada.
Nada.
Bye.
Bye-bye.